London, 1888. Imagine a city of 4 million people, powered by coal smoke, horse manure, and the distinct Victorian belief that poverty builds character. Streetlights are dim. Police communication technology consists mostly of running very fast and shouting. And the internet does not exist yet, which means rumors spread the old-fashioned way, through newspapers, gossip, and people dramatically whispering things like, "Have you heard about the murders in Whitechapel?" Because in the autumn of 1888, someone in London had developed a deeply disturbing hobby. Not knitting, not stamp collecting, murder. And not just ordinary murder either. This person was targeting women in the East End of London with a brutality that shocked even a city already accustomed to crime, poverty, and the occasional gentleman falling into the Thames after too much gin. The killer was precise, fast, invisible. Police had no suspect, no clear motive, no reliable witnesses, which meant London had just acquired something that would fascinate the world for more than a century. A serial killer with a nickname that sounded suspiciously like a Victorian comic book villain, Jack the Ripper. To understand the panic surrounding the Ripper, you first need to understand Whitechapel. Whitechapel in the 1880s was not exactly the postcard side of London. If central London was a polished capital of the British Empire, Whitechapel was the overcrowded basement where the empire stored its problems. Thousands of immigrants, laborers, and unemployed workers lived in cramped housing blocks where multiple families often shared a single room. Sanitation was questionable. Employment was unstable. Alcohol was cheap. Crime was common. Walking through district at night meant navigating narrow alleyways, dim gas lamps, and enough fog to make Sherlock Holmes feel professionally validated. In other words, it was exactly the kind of place where someone could commit crimes and disappear into the darkness before anyone had time to process what just happened. And that is precisely what Jack the Ripper did. The first widely recognized victim appeared in August of 1888. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. She was found early in the morning on a dark street in Whitechapel. The murder shocked local residents. But at first the police did not realize they were dealing with a serial killer. Violent crime in the East End was unfortunately not rare. Then another victim appeared, Annie Chapman, and suddenly investigators noticed a pattern. The murders were happening at night. The victims were vulnerable women living in poverty, and the killer seemed to strike with alarming speed. The level of violence suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Within weeks, the fear began spreading through Whitechapel like wildfire. Women avoided walking alone. Residents formed neighborhood patrols. Newspapers began publishing dramatic headlines that made the situation sound like London had accidentally hired a horror novelist to design its crime reports. Then things became even stranger. Newspapers started receiving letters written by someone claiming to be the killer. One message opened with the words, "Dear Boss." The letter described the murders in mocking detail and ended with a signature that would become infamous, Jack the Ripper. Now, historians believe many of these letters were probably written by journalists or pranksters trying to sell more newspapers. Victorian journalism was not exactly famous for restraint. If a story could sell papers, editors were happy to add a little drama. And nothing sells newspapers faster than a mysterious killer who writes letters introducing himself like a theatrical supervillain. Nevertheless, the nickname stuck. The killer was no longer just an unknown criminal. He was now Jack the Ripper. Once the nickname appeared in newspapers, the panic escalated rapidly. Whitechapel residents began organizing patrol groups. Police increased night patrols. Investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses. But the problem was painfully simple. The crimes happened quickly. The streets were dark, and the killer vanished into the city before anyone could identify him. Imagine trying to track down a criminal in a city the size of London without fingerprints, DNA, security cameras, or radio communication. Victorian detectives had notebooks and mustaches, which, while impressive, were not particularly useful for solving forensic mysteries. Historians generally focus on 5 victims most strongly connected to the Ripper. These are known as the canonical 5. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine et al., Mary Jane Kelly. Each murder increased public fear. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was discovered in November 1888 inside a small room in Whitechapel. The brutality of that crime shocked even hardened investigators. After this murder, the killings suddenly stopped. The Ripper vanished. No arrest, no confession, no explanation, just silence. Because the killer was never identified, the mystery did not fade after the murders ended. It multiplied. Almost immediately after the final crime in November 1888, speculation began spreading through London like a second epidemic. Newspapers printed theories. Police files accumulated names. Amateur detectives, Victorian versions of modern internet sleuths, began constructing elaborate explanations about who the killer might have been, and the suspect list quickly became imaginative. Some investigators believed the murderer must have been a surgeon or medical student. The reasoning sounded logical on the surface. The injury suggested someone who understood human anatomy. In an era when Victorian society viewed doctors with a mixture of admiration and mild suspicion, the idea of a medically trained killer fascinated the public. Others pointed toward butchers or slaughterhouse workers, men accustomed to knives and late-night work in the labyrinth of Whitechapel streets. To many residents, these suspects felt more believable than the idea of a gentleman doctor secretly roaming the slums at night. But the theories did not stop there. As the legend of Jack the Ripper grew, the suspect pool expanded into territory that would make a modern crime podcast producer extremely happy. Artists were accused. Foreign immigrants were accused. A well-dressed barrister was once suspected simply because someone thought he looked nervous. At various points in the following decades, investigators and writers have proposed that the killer might have been a famous painter, a Polish barber, a mentally unstable doctor, or even a member of the British royal family. The royal theory, which appeared in the 20th century, suggests a conspiracy involving secret marriages, hidden heirs, and an elaborate cover-up orchestrated by powerful figures. It reads less like a police investigation and more like someone watched a Victorian drama and decided it needed additional intrigue. Entire books have been written defending one suspect after another with passionate certainty. Each author typically begins with the same confident promise. This time the mystery will finally be solved. Then follows several hundred pages of circumstantial evidence, historical interpretation, and occasionally the investigative equivalent of connecting random dots on a map until they form a shape that vaguely resembles a conclusion. Some of these investigations are impressively researched, combing through police archives, hospital records, and witness testimony from 1888. Others feel like someone stared at an old photograph from the Victorian era, noticed a man with a slightly unsettling mustache, and thought, yes, that one looks suspicious. Despite more than a century of speculation, forensic analysis, and historical investigation, none of these theories have produced definitive proof. No arrest was ever made. No confession was verified. No document has surfaced that definitively reveals the identity of the killer, which leaves one unavoidable conclusion. More than 130 years later, Jack the Ripper remains the most famous unidentified murderer in modern history, a shadow moving through the gaslit streets of Victorian London, leaving behind questions that have never been answered. What keeps the story of Jack the Ripper alive is not simply the brutality of the crimes. Victorian London had seen violence before. What transformed this case into a permanent historical obsession was a void at its center, a mystery that never closed. Human beings have a profound discomfort with unfinished narratives. We expect crimes to end with an arrest, a confession, or at the very least a suspect whose name can be written confidently in a history book. The Ripper case refuses to provide that satisfaction. Instead, it leaves investigators staring into a blank space where the identity of the killer should be. Consider the scale of the puzzle. In 1888, London was already one of the largest cities on Earth, a sprawling maze of narrow streets, markets, factories, docks, and overcrowded housing blocks. Millions of people moved through it every day. Somewhere within that enormous urban machine lived a person who committed a sequence of murders that terrified the entire city and then simply vanished back into population. No arrest, no confirmed suspect, no definitive explanation. Imagine a modern serial killer operating in a city the size of London today and leaving behind nothing identifiable. No DNA, no digital trail, no surveillance footage, no reliable witness who could describe a face. The idea feels almost impossible in the modern age of forensic science and constant monitoring. Yet in Victorian London, it happened. That absence of resolution turned the crimes into something larger than a police investigation. The case became a historical riddle. Writers, criminologists, historians, and amateur detectives have spent more than a century attempting to solve it. Each generation convinced that new research, newly discovered documents, or modern forensic theories might finally reveal the truth. Entire libraries of books now exist proposing suspects: doctors, artists, sailors, immigrants, aristocrats, and even members of the royal family. Some theories are carefully researched reconstructions of Victorian life. Others read like elaborate detective novels written backward from the conclusion. But every theory eventually encounters the same problem. The evidence never quite closes the case. Meanwhile, the setting that produced the legend has largely disappeared. The Whitechapel of 1888, its cramped lodging houses, dim gas lamps, and fog-covered alleys, has been transformed by more than a century of urban change. Modern London is brighter, louder, larger, and infinitely more monitored. Today, a crime like the RIPPER murders would trigger an avalanche of surveillance footage, forensic analysis, digital records, and international media coverage within hours. In the 19th century, investigators relied on eyewitness testimony, handwritten notes, and officers walking the streets with lanterns. The killer existed in the narrow gap between those limited tools and the immense size of the city. That gap swallowed him. More than 130 years later, Jack the Ripper remains less a solved crime than a permanent shadow in the history of London. A reminder that sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not the ones we understand, but the ones that history refuses to explain. Jack the Ripper committed a sequence of murders in London during the autumn of 1888, and then, almost as abruptly as it appeared, he vanished. Not captured, not identified, not even reliably described. The police files contain interviews, witness statements, medical reports, and a growing list of suspects, yet none of them ever led to a courtroom, a confession, or a name written permanently into the record of British criminal history. Imagine committing crimes in one of the largest cities on Earth, triggering national panic, dominating newspaper headlines for months, and then simply walking away. No fingerprints were available to investigators. No surveillance cameras watched the streets. No DNA evidence waited patiently in a laboratory freezer for future scientists to analyze. Victorian detectives relied on lanterns, notebooks, witness memory, and the hope that someone would eventually recognize the killer in a crowd. Unfortunately for them, London in the late 19th century contained millions of people, narrow streets that twisted like mazes, and enough fog rolling in from the Thames to make visual identification slightly more difficult than modern police work. The murder stopped in November of 1888. Just like that, no dramatic final chase. No villain revealed at the end of the chapter. The killer who had terrified Whitechapel, who had caused newspapers to sell out across Britain and forced the police into one of the largest investigations of the century, simply faded back into the population of Victorian London. Perhaps he moved to another district. Perhaps he emigrated to another country. Perhaps he lived the rest of his life as an ordinary citizen, walking the same streets that had once been flooded with police patrols searching for him. And that possibility is what keeps the mystery alive. Because somewhere in the crowded, smoke-filled history of 19th century London, there may have been a man who frightened an entire city, dominated the headlines of the British Empire, and then quietly blended back into everyday life without ever being recognized. No arrest, no confession, just a name invented by a letter writer, echoing through history like the title of a ghost story. Jack the Ripper. If you enjoy stories about the strangest and most mysterious events in history, subscribe to the channel, because history is full of unbelievable stories, and some of them still have no ending.